Chapter 6. Laurel Wycliffe was putting away the last of the breakfast dishes when a knock came on the door. Laurel hastily tucked her brown hair beneath a kerchief while she went to the door. When she opened it, she recognized the tall person standing in front of the doorway. This time, he had a small spotted brown owl perched on his shoulder. Mr. Potter, Harry," said Laurel, flustered. "Hello, Mrs. Wycliffe," said Mr. Potter politely. You just missed Dillon. He's already left for the office." "Actually, Mrs. Wycliffe, I came to see you," said Mr. Potter quietly. "May I come in?" "I guess so. Please, come in." "Have a seat. Would you like some tea?" "Please," said Mr. Potter as he sat down. The tiny owl looked around with interest, but did not leave Mr. Potter's shoulder. "I wanted to let you know," began Mr. Potter, while Laurel bustled around the kitchen, "that Holly arrived at Hogwarts safely and should be beginning class today." "Thank you," said Laurel, bringing in the tea and a plate of biscuits. Fortunately, the water was already hot. "Also," he added, while she poured the tea, "I'm afraid I got Holly a kitten. I hope this is okay," he added quickly. "You see, Hogwarts encourages the ownership of pets among the students. It helps them learn responsibility, and Holly was so happy. If having a cat will create problems for her here, we would be happy to keep the cat at our house during the holidays and vacation." "No," said Laurel, sitting down across from Mr. Potter after she finished serving the tea. "I don't think a cat will be a problem. Holly has always wanted a pet." Mr. Potter smiled. "That's good to know," he said. "It's a really cute kitten." "Is there anything else, Mr. Potter?" "Actually, there is." "Ah," thought Laurel, the real purpose of the visit. "You asked," Mr. Potter began, while giving the owl a piece of his biscuit. He looked perfectly at ease with an owl perched on his shoulder. "That I make it possible for you to contact us in Hogwarts. Unfortunately, we do not have a telephone, nor do we have a postal address, so I had to come up with another way for you to contact us." He reached into his pocket and pulled out two small, identical turquoise-colored books. They looked like something purchased out of a stationery shop. Each bore the word "address" in purple. A small purple glass chip in the shape of a diamond ornamented each book. "This is for you," he said, handing one of the books to Laurel. "Open it, please." Laurel did so. The purple-lined pages were blank. It looked very ordinary. "Have you a pen or pencil you can use to write?" Laurel fetched a pen and looked questioningly at Mr. Potter. "Please write something in the book," he stated. Laurel hesitated, thinking, and then she wrote her name, Laurel Lynn Wycliffe, in the book. "Now," instructed Mr. Potter, "close the book." Laurel did so. Immediately the other book, the one she had not written in, began to beep softly, and its purple glass chip lit up. "That's odd," thought Laurel, looking at it curiously. "Please open the second book," instructed Mr. Potter. Laurel did so, and the beeping stopped. Inside the second book, Laurel saw the words Laurel Lynn Wycliffe, written in her own handwriting. "This is the book I shall have at my house," explained Mr. Potter, gently removing the book which had beeped from her hands. "May I?" he asked, taking her pen as well. Mr. Potter wrote some words in this book, the book that had beeped, and closed it. Immediately, the glass chip in the first book lit up, but there was no sound. "That is the book you will keep," continued Mr. Potter. "Please open it again." Laurel did. Her name had vanished, and in its place were the words, "My name is Harry Potter." "If you wish to contact me or my family, all you have to do is write in your book. The light and the sound will go off, alerting us that you have written. My wife or I will read the message and get back to you. Your book does not beep, as you will be expecting and looking for a response. When you see the book light up, you will know we have responded. The words vanish after the book is closed, so whatever you have written remains private." Mr. Potter sat back. "Now you have a way to contact us." Laurel took the book and looked at it thoughtfully. "Thank you," she said softly. "That was very considerate." Mr. Potter nodded. "Unfortunately," he continued, "Hogwarts is pretty rigid about contact methods, and if you wish to contact anyone at school, you will have to use an owl. You can always ask us to send you an owl for this purpose, and it would be no difficulty to send you one. I brought this one here in case you wished to write a note to Holly." "Owls," thought Laurel. She'd always known that Dylan had little liking for birds, but Dylan practically jumped out of his skin when he saw that tiny, fluffy little owl waiting for them after they dropped Vernon at his school. Dylan seemed afraid to touch it, and Laurel had to remove the note attached to the owl's leg. The owl flew off into the night before she had unrolled the message. They were both glad to hear from Holly, though. Hogwarts hadn't sounded too different from other schools at all. Laurel cleared her throat. "How do I use one?" she asked hesitantly. "It's very easy," replied Mr. Potter. "Have you a piece of paper?" Laurel fetched one. "Write your message on the paper. Take your time. I'm in no hurry." Laurel thought. She hadn't actually planned on sending a message, but since he was waiting. So she scribbled a quick note to Holly and looked up. "Now what?" "Fold your letter and roll it small." Rolling it around a pencil should work. So Laurel rolled her letter. "Write Holly's full name on the outside and tie your letter to the strings hanging from the owl's leg. Tie it tight." Mr. Potter held out the owl in his hand so Laurel could reach the strings. "Won't it fall out?" asked Laurel as she tied the strings. "It never has," Mr. Potter assured her. "Now, tell the owl where you want her to take your letter. Make sure you use Holly's full name, as there may be other Hollys at the school." He held the tiny owl up to Laurel's face. "I feel stupid talking to an owl," said Laurel self-consciously. "Does it really understand me?" Mr. Potter smiled. "Owls are very smart," he replied. Laurel took a deep breath and looked into the owl's eyes. "Take this letter to Holly Wycliffe at Hogwarts," she said. The owl turned and stretched out its wings and flew out the open door. How had the door gotten open? "How does it know who Holly is?" she asked as she watched it fly out of sight. "Honestly, I have no idea. But tomorrow morning at breakfast that owl will fly in, find Holly, and drop off your message. They never miss," he replied. "Are all the owls so small?" inquired Laurel. All the owls, thought Harry. So Holly had written. Good for her. "Actually," he replied out loud to answer Laurel's question, "owls come in all sizes. I had a lovely snowy owl for some time. The person sending the message picks the owls. If Holly should write, and you wish to write back," continued Harry, "ask the owl to stay, because you have a reply. The owl will wait for your message and then take it back. If there is nothing else, I won't take any more of your time." Mr. Potter stood to leave. "Actually, Mr. Potter, there is." Mr. Potter stopped and looked at Laurel. He said nothing, but waited for her to continue. Laurel took a deep breath. "I want to know more about you," she said. "Me?" Mr. Potter said in surprise while sitting back down. "There is not much to say. I have a wife and 3 lovely children, 2 of which are currently attending Hogwarts. What are their names?" "My wife's name is Jenny," replied Mr. Potter. "Then there's James and Albus. They're at Hogwarts. My youngest is named Lily. She's 9 years old." Mr. Potter finished smiling at the thought. "Where do you live?" "In London," said Mr. Potter. "It's a fairly large house I inherited from my godfather," he added. "You grew up with Dylan?" "Yes, ma'am. My parents died when I was 1. I lived with my aunt and uncle, Dylan's parents, and Dylan until I was 17. "And you don't like each other?" Mr. Potter was silent for a moment before answering. "No, not really," he admitted quietly. "May I ask why?" Mr. Potter was silent for an even longer time. Finally he spoke. "You obviously love your husband, Mrs. Wycliffe, and he loves you. His parents are your in-laws. Dylan's family sheltered me when I needed it. I will not speak ill of them to you." Laurel nodded. It had been unfair of her to ask that. "And you are a wizard?" asked Laurel, changing the subject. "That goes without saying, ma'am. You already know that. Why?" "Why what? Why isn't it said?" demanded Laurel. "Why didn't I know?" "Wizards and witches have a bad reputation, ma'am," replied Harry calmly. "They've been hunted in the past. When dealing with non-wizards, it's always best to be discreet." "But among your own family?" persisted Laurel. "When I asked Dylan about you, he claimed he knew nothing but that you were a wizard. And when I suggested we ask his parents, Dylan went into a panic, and he begged that we not mention any of this to them." "If Dylan suggests you not mention this to his parents, by all means you should listen to him." Laurel waited for further explanation. Harry paused, as if choosing his words carefully. Dylan probably knows very little about wizards and such, he finally said. Dylan's parents were very angry when I decided to attend Hogwarts. It kept the peace best if I said nothing about Hogwarts or wizards when I stayed with them. Oh, said Laurel. And this Voldemort stuff? That is long over, said Mr. Potter simply. To talk about it brings me nothing but bad memories. I truly regret any of it spilled over into your life. Now, he said, standing up, I really must be going, so if you'll excuse me. Mr. Potter bowed slightly and walked to the door. Yes, of course, said Laurel, picking up the now empty cups and dishes. She had hundreds more questions, but recognized that Mr. Potter would probably say nothing further. Thank you for coming. If you are curious about Hogwarts, Mr. Potter added when he reached the entryway, you can always ask Holly when she comes home for the holidays. I'm sure she'll be happy to answer you. Good day, Mrs. Wycliffe. Good day, Mr. Potter, replied Laurel, and Mr. Potter left as silently as he had arrived. Holly, Becky, and Mark left breakfast early to go to their potions class. Holly wanted to get there and settled before everyone else arrived. She hated that new person's stare and how students would watch every move when a new student arrived. The potions class was somewhere down in the dungeons. Mark led the way, and it was Becky who whispered encouraging words to Holly as they walked. Professor Slughorn really knows his potions, she told Holly. We spent last week looking at all sorts of plants, both dried and fresh, learning to recognize each one and its qualities. Holly nodded. She had gotten that much from copying Mark's notes. Mark had included all sorts of sketches and descriptions of each plant studied, along with several more he had gotten out of their books, Magical Drafts and Potions. Prefect Gwyn says he likes to give a quiz the second week to see how much we remembered, so we'll probably get a quiz today. You're lucky, continued Becky. You'll probably be excused from the quiz since you weren't here last week. Afterwards, we'll get to mix actual potions. They reached the potions room, opened the door, and stepped inside. Professor Slughorn was an extremely short, old, fat, bald man with a walrus mustache. He wore burgundy-red velvet robes and sat on a pink, puffy, comfortable-looking chair behind his desk. He looked up at their arrival. Almost immediately, Professor Slughorn's face broke into a smile of immense pleasure. "Lily!" he said in delight, looking at Holly. Holly looked around in case someone else had entered the room. Seeing no one, she spoke. No, sir," she corrected. "My name is Holly. Holly Wycliffe. I'm new." Professor Slughorn did a double-take and looked at Holly again. "But you look so much like—" he began. "No, of course not. That was years ago. And you're in Hufflepuff, not Gryffindor. My apologies." He shuffled through his papers. "Holly, yes. I received a note about you from Professor Iverson, and one from Madame Pomfrey." He looked up again at Holly. "Welcome to my class, Miss Wycliffe. Miss Smith and Mr. Owens, why don't you show Miss Wycliffe where to place her things? Then you may take a seat over on the right." Professor Slughorn continued to watch Holly with a dreamy, thoughtful look on his face, while the three put their supplies away. Holly wondered who Lily was. Holly was seated at her desk, deep in reviewing Mark's notes, when the Ravenclaw students walked in. Holly could tell they had entered without even looking up or hearing a thing. She could feel their arrival by the change of emotions in the room. With Sasha curled up on her lap, purring happily, Holly had felt a cocoon of contentment surrounding her. Beyond that cocoon had been the dull roar of the generally cheerful feelings of Becky and Mark and the other Hufflepuff students that had arrived. The Ravenclaw students walked in oozing confidence. Holly noticed the difference immediately. How odd, she thought. No wonder school had always given her a mixed jumble of emotions every day. Holly had known about feeling other people's pain, of course, but had never realized she'd been feeling other people's emotions as well. She filed that information away for future reference and concentrated on class instruction instead. True to the predictions of Prefect Gwyn, Professor Slughorn started class with a quiz. "Every tray of plant is different," he announced, "so don't bother looking at your neighbor's work. Use the paper provided, please." He passed out a tray of plant samples to each student. "Tell me what you know about the plants on your tray. Let's see which of you are serious about potions." He stopped in front of Holly and handed her a tray of samples. "I don't expect you to score well, Miss Wycliffe, but why don't you give it a try anyway? You may use your text if you wish." Holly nodded and bent to look at the plants in the tray. There were only 4 plants in the tray, and to Holly's immense surprise, the plants matched perfectly with some Mark had written about. Having just reviewed her notes, she began writing quickly before she forgot what she had read. Holly never bothered to pull out her text before the professor called for their papers. Next came the practical portion, mixing actual potions. Holly left her seat in Sasha while she went to get her supplies. Scarcely had she gone 2 steps from her seat when she suddenly felt overwhelmed with all sorts of emotions. Nothing bad, but the surprise of it caused Holly to fumble and bump into one of the Ravenclaw students already carrying her supplies. The supplies spilled with a clatter all over the floor. "I am so sorry," mumbled Holly, still distracted by all the emotions surrounding her. She bent to help the girl pick up the supplies. The girl had hazel-colored eyes and thick, curly, shoulder-length, red-brown hair that was parted down the middle and pinned back on each side with blue bows. "Thanks," the girl replied while collecting her things. Holly handed the girl the rest of her fallen supplies and then hurried to get her own. Potion-making looked a lot like cooking. Holly had helped her mum cook a lot. Cooking required precise measurements and following directions carefully. Their first potion was supposed to be a remedy for headaches. Holly read everything carefully before beginning. Then she followed the directions as precisely as possible, though she did wonder what difference it made to stir 3 1/2 times versus 2 or 4 times. When their time had ended, Holly carefully bottled up her potion and turned it in. She was pleased to note that some of the other potions had similar silver-gray colors. Professor Slughorn reviewed all the student potions critically. He sorted them by color. "These," he said, pointing to a few bottles containing a muddy purple liquid, "are obviously contaminated. You added either too much of one or more ingredients, or your cauldron was dirty, and the other ingredients got mixed in that shouldn't be there. Make sure you clean your cauldrons well before each potion you make, and measure carefully. 2 2/3 dragonfly wings is not the same as 2 1/2 wings." "These potions," he continued, gesturing to a variety of bottles containing various milky-colored liquids, "are no good either. They were stirred way too long. You need to follow directions more carefully," he admonished. "These flasks with silver-colored potions," he said with a pleased voice, pointing to a small group of bottles remaining, "would probably be successful headache remedies once they were cured properly. 1 house point per person for the students who mixed these." Holly flushed with pleasure at the praise, though she wasn't sure what a house point was. Next came cleanup. Taking the professor's comments about contamination to heart, Holly scrubbed her cauldron especially well. The Ravenclaw girl that Holly had bumped into earlier came up next to her and began carefully cleaning her cauldron as well. "Good job on the potion," she congratulated Holly. "Thanks," said Holly. She was ashamed to admit that she had no idea to whom the other silvery-gray potions belonged. "I'm Layla Pilkington," the girl continued as they worked. "Holly Wycliffe," replied Holly. "You're new," Layla announced. "You came here Saturday morning." "Yes," acknowledged Holly, wiping her cauldron dry. Layla was incredibly observant. Holly hadn't noticed Layla amongst all the other students eating breakfast that morning. "Why were you late?" Layla asked bluntly. "I was sick," said Holly simply. Then she added, "My parents are Muggles." Having Muggle parents seemed to explain everything unusual around here, and it worked for Layla also. "Oh," said Layla, wiping her cauldron dry and putting it on the shelf. "Well, welcome to Hogwarts." "Thanks," said Holly, putting her own cauldron away. Then she hurried to join Mark and Becky. "Hey, how'd you 2 manage to get the potion right?" asked Mark. His own potion had turned a muddy white. "We followed the directions, of course," said Becky. "I told you were stirring too long." "But it wasn't thoroughly mixed yet," protested Mark. "Making potions is a lot like cooking," agreed Holly. "You've got to follow the directions exactly if you want it to come out right. Don't you cook?" No," admitted Mark. "The house elves do it." "Oh," said Holly. "Well, I'd have never gotten through the quiz without your notes. You take terrific notes." Her own attempt at taking notes today looked blotchy and unreadable. "Thanks. Just wish I could remember them after I write them," said Mark. "I can't remember a thing when it comes to quizzes and tests." "Tell you what," suggested Holly. "We'll help you with mixing potions and studying, and you share your notes with us. Deal?" "Deal." Charms class came next. Professor Flitwick sat on his desk cross-legged with his eyes and wand pointed at the ceiling. He greeted the early arrival of Holly, Mark, and Becky with barely a glance, merely directing them to their seats. Then he returned his attention to the ceiling. Holly looked up and saw all sorts of colored balls floating in the air as moving gently about. Some of the balls sparkled and shined. Others gave off sparks. Every imaginable color of ball swirled around. Watching carefully, Holly noticed the balls swirl to make intricate shapes and patterns in the air. Professor Flitwick pointed his wand to a ball floating in the air. That ball would move, striking other balls. As the balls were struck, they vanished with a soft pop. The remaining balls swirled faster and forming new patterns. The professor kept hitting balls until only the last ball remained. It moved like a blaze of light racing across the ceiling. With careful aiming, this ball, too, was struck. It vanished along with the striking ball. The professor lowered his wand and pulled out some papers, which he began reading. Holly was settled with Sasha on her lap and deep into reviewing Mark's notes when the Slytherin students walked in. As with the Ravenclaws, the emotional feeling of the room changed with their arrival. This time, however, the group emanated disdain and contempt. They barely glanced at the Hufflepuff students already seated and ignored them as they sat. Then Professor Flitwick stood on the desk to lecture. He was so short, standing on the desk was probably the only way he could see all the students. He had a high-pitched voice that matched his small size. Wand practice in charms was fairly simple. Make a cube move across the table using the wand. That sounded easy, but one had to concentrate, flick the wand just so, and say the proper words with the correct inflection. Becky was the first of the Hufflepuffs to get her cube to move. She flushed with pleasure, smiling at her new wand that made it possible. Several other students met with success also. Holly stood intent on making her wand work. Sasha jumped up onto her shoulder and happily continued purring in her ear. So used to Sasha by now, Holly hadn't even noticed the move. "Hey!" shouted a Slytherin voice. "She's got a cat on her shoulder!" All eyes turned to Holly and Sasha. "Mr. Richards," squeaked Professor Flitwick in an annoyed voice, "I explained to the class, including you, that I will not tolerate interruptions that prevent student concentration on classwork." "But she's got a cat on her shoulder!" protested Mr. Richards. He had sandy brown hair and an angry face. "So? We're not supposed to have animals here." "Have you a cat you wish to bring to class?" asked Professor Flitwick. No, but when you do, please talk with me privately. In the meantime," continued Professor Flitwick, 5 points from Slytherin for interrupting the class. I trust you will not do it again, Mr. Richards." With that, he dismissed the student. Mr. Richards looked like he was ready to argue some more, but his classmates nudged him to be quiet. The rest of the students hastily returned to spell-casting practice. While all the students looked industriously at work, Holly could feel the change in the atmosphere. The Slytherin disdain and contempt had turned to anger. Mr. Richards sat near, so she knew much of the anger must be his. But the anger felt stronger than one person, not just Mr. Richards. Holly was sure the anger was directed at her for making them lose house points. She hadn't meant to, but somehow Holly had made an enemy, maybe more than one. Holly had herbology with the Gryffindor students after lunch. Professor Longbottom was a tall, husky younger man who obviously loved his topic. The students met at a long table already covered with potted plants. Then the professor had all the students wading in the muck, hunting and picking magical tubers and roots. Sasha did not like the water, and spent her time on the water's edge playing with the butterflies. Holly found she didn't mind Sasha's absence so much. The Gryffindors had not arrived in force with a single emotion. Instead, she felt the usual emotional mix she had often felt while at school last year. Holly had always managed to deal with it before. Now, however, she knew the cause of those extra emotions. Knowing that cause made all the difference in the world. With Sasha, Holly had begun to recognize her own emotions from others. While she couldn't exactly block the other emotions, Holly could at least ignore them better. Still, she kept her distance, hunting for roots away from the other students, using the familiar emotions of Mark and Becky as buffers. Holly watched her cousin Albus from afar. He seemed nice enough. He laughed easily with his classmates and displayed no concern over getting wet. Did he watch her as she watched him? She couldn't tell. Once Holly heard Albus call the professor Neville. They must know each other outside of class. It took longer than expected to clean up after herbology, but Becky didn't seem worried about being late to their next class, History of Magic. Nor did she seem to think it was important for Holly to arrive there early. Consequently, they arrived along with the other Hufflepuff students. Most of the Ravenclaws were already seated. Holly followed Becky and laid her assignment on the professor's desk with the other papers. Then she hastily found an empty seat against the wall away from the other Ravenclaw students and sat down. As the Hogwarts clock chimed the hour, the pearly gray transparent form of Professor Binns seemed to rise directly out of the professor's desk and began to lecture. "A ghost?" squeaked Holly in panic. "You didn't tell me Professor Binns was a ghost?" Becky giggled. "Hush up," whispered Mark urgently. "I'm trying to take notes. Professor Binns never slows down, and he never repeats." So Holly and Becky pulled out their own quills and diligently attempted to take notes too. "I can't believe I wrote a foot-long essay on Roman wizards in Britain to hand it in to a ghost," said Holly to Mark and Becky when they were finally dismissed from class. "How's he going to grade them?" "You wait," said Mark. "Come Wednesday, those papers will be exactly in the same position as they are right now, but they'll all be graded." "Prefects Ben and Gwen say you don't want to mess with Professor Binns," added Becky. "He gives out the same assignments every year, but you still have to do your own work. One of the Slytherin boys put a paper on that desk and it burst into flames. It burned all the other papers on the desk at the time, too. Everyone had to take a 0. The Slytherins wouldn't say, but the Hufflepuffs all thought that the Slytherin paper had been copied. That's why it caught on fire." "Stephen Willets told me how he saw a Gryffindor student try to put a Weasley dung bomb on the desk," added Mark. "Dung bombs have 30-second timers on them to enable the student to get well away before the bombs go off. But this bomb went off in the boy's hands before it even touched the desk. It took 2 whole weeks before that boy quit smelling like cow poop. Was that boy ever embarrassed?" "I think the emotions are stronger than I ever remember feeling at school last year," said Holly. She was discussing her day with Madame Pomfrey after dinner. "There could be several reasons for that," said Madame Pomfrey. "They may just seem stronger because you have muted emotions to compare them against. Also, it could be that wizards project their emotions more strongly than muggles, and, of course, you are getting older and your abilities may be growing with you." "What's really strange," continued Holly, "was that the Ravenclaws all had a single emotion when they walked into class, as did the Slytherins, but not the Gryffindors, and I don't feel anything much from the Hufflepuffs. Of course," she continued, "I pretty much know everyone in the Hufflepuff house, so maybe they all just seem normal now." "Oh?" said Madame Pomfrey as she weighed Holly and gave her the once-over physically. "What did you feel with the Ravenclaws?" Holly thought about it. "Mostly confidence," she replied, "like they were all prepared for class and nothing could faze them." "And the Slytherins?" Holly thought some more. "At first they kind of ignored us. But then," she thought about that incident with Sasha, "I don't think they liked us, or rather me, very much. The Gryffindors were a mixture of everything. No one single emotion stood out." "Actually, I'm not surprised," said Madame Pomfrey. "Rowena Ravenclaw, the founder of the Ravenclaw house, wanted only the wisest and the cleverest students in her house. Ravenclaw students are smart, and they know it." "Oh." "Salazar Slytherin, the founder of the Slytherin house, sought those who loved power, people who were both clever and ambitious. One is of little interest to them, unless one can help them achieve their goals." "Or blocks them," added Holly, remembering the anger she had felt when the Slytherin lost house points. "Or blocks them," agreed Madame Pomfrey. "And the Gryffindors?" asked Holly curiously. "Well, Godric Gryffindor prized those who were noble, brave, and bold. That's a way of life, not an emotion. So of course no one emotion would stand out." "And Hufflepuff?" "Helga Hufflepuff valued those who worked hard, were honest and true. Hufflepuffs don't seek fame or glory. They are good, solid people, the backbone of the wizard world." Holly smiled. That sounded a lot like her. She liked her Hufflepuff friends. Holly had worried she should have been placed in Gryffindor with all the other Potters, but she didn't feel at all noble or brave. "What house are you from?" asked Holly shyly. "Hufflepuff, of course," replied Madame Pomfrey proudly. Holly nodded. Of course, she thought to herself. Then Holly thought of something else. Madame Pomfrey," she asked hesitantly. "Yes?" "What house was, you-know-who from?" Holly thought she already knew the answer, but she wanted to be sure. Slytherin, replied Madame Pomfrey briskly. He was about as ambitious as they come. Mind you, his idea of power meant killing off the opposition and enslaving darn near everyone else. He came pretty close to achieving it, too. But that's all over now, thanks to Harry Potter. Madame Pomfrey finished her exam and addressed Holly. Well, she said, you've made remarkable progress in a short amount of time. Holly smiled at the praise. But I don't think we should attempt to do too much too soon. If any one particular emotion stands out above the rest, try to figure out its source. Otherwise, I want you to keep on doing what you've done so far and check back in with me on Friday. Yes, ma'am, said Holly happily. She rose and left the room. Before returning to her dorm, Holly decided to make a quick trip to the library to check out some books for herbology and potions homework. The actual assignments weren't due until Friday, but it never hurt to get started early. So, with her arms loaded with books, Holly headed back to her dorm. One book, labeled Common and Uncommon Weeds, What They Really Do, had a cover of scratchy roots that Holly could swear kept tickling and trying to grab her arms. Holly had scarcely passed the grand hall when someone bumped into her so hard that Sasha spilled off her shoulder and all her books went flying. "Hey!" said an angry voice. "Watch where you're going!" "Me?" squeaked Holly in surprise. "It wasn't me, you—" She looked up at the angry voice and saw a tall Slytherin boy wearing a prefect badge towering over her. She recognized him as the one she had encountered with Ben and Mark Saturday night. "Me? Are you accusing me? Why would I run into a pipsqueak like you? I think you owe me an apology," the prefect demanded. But Holly didn't know what to do. Her head was overwhelmed with conflicting emotions. Sasha was circling Holly's feet, hissing angrily at the prefect. Holly felt shame and embarrassment at being singled out and unjustly accused. And the prefect, well, he seemed to feel nothing but righteous anger at being bumped. But she hadn't bumped into him at all. "Well, well, well. Are my eyes deceiving me?" broke in a new voice. Both Holly and the prefect turned to look at the source of the new voice. Holly recognized the speaker as her cousin James, walking forward to join the two. Nearly as tall as the prefect, James seemed totally unconcerned and unafraid of the angry prefect. "Here I thought you only bullied Gryffindor students, and now I find you terrorizing a Hufflepuff. Are you expanding your horizons, Richards, or were the Gryffindors too much for you?" "You watch your mouth, Potter," said Richards, now directing his anger at James. "I'm a prefect now." "Of course you are," agreed James lightly. "So, shouldn't you be off looking for some rule breakers? This little Hufflepuff surely doesn't fall into that category, especially—" James lowered his voice so it couldn't be heard by the other students now gathered to watch the show. "Since it was you that bumped into her. I did see you veer into her, Richards, and I'll tell that to any person who comes by if you want to make an issue of it." Richards glowered a moment at James and then turned away. "Oh, never mind," he muttered, and stalked off. The two stood watching him leave. When he was out of sight, Holly bent to collect her books. "Thanks," whispered Holly. She felt unsteady from the recent onslaught of strong emotions. "I don't think he likes you very much," observed James quietly as he knelt down to help. "There was," began Holly hesitantly, a Richards in class today that lost Slytherin 5 house points. I think the person blamed me." "Ah," said James, while brushing off one of the books. "That would explain it. Tom Richards has a younger brother, Anthony, in the first years. It would be pretty embarrassing for Tom if Anthony lost Slytherin house points." "But," began Holly. "I didn't—" "Of course not," agreed James. "But Slytherins never take the blame for anything. It's always someone else's fault." He picked up the scratchy weed book with one hand and held out his free hand. "By the way, I'm James Potter." Holly shook his hand. "I'm Holly Wycliffe. You're my, cousin," finished James. "Yeah, I know. Dad wrote me." He straightened and the two began to walk together towards the stairs. "What else did your dad say?" asked Holly, interested. "Well, he said you were a cousin from a Muggle family and didn't know anything at all about wizards." "That's true," agreed Holly. "Did he explain why I was arriving late?" "Not really," replied James. "Just that you had been sick." They turned onto the stairs. "Did he write anything more?" "Not much," admitted James. Just to keep an eye on you and to give you, he hesitated, your space. Oh. Holly considered that. That was thoughtful of him. Does, your brother know? Albus? Of course. Rose, too, James added. She's family. Rose is our cousin on my mum's side, he explained. Holly considered that. Did you, she began hesitantly, did you tell anyone else that we're related? Are you kidding? James sounded shocked at the suggestion. I wouldn't do that to anyone, let alone someone from a Muggle family who just learned she was a wizard. What do you mean? Well, I don't know if you noticed, but Dad is kind of famous. Yes, I had. Unfortunately, continued James, anyone who is somehow connected to Dad kind of shares that fame. They came to an end of some stairs and mounted the next. When I first came here, James added, explaining, everyone was looking at me, pointing and whispering behind my back. And then came the questions. What's your dad like? What's it like to be the son of a hero? Are you planning to do something heroic, too? I didn't even know Dad was famous. I mean, sure, I knew everyone liked Dad, but I didn't know why. Holly nodded, remembering how nice everyone had been to Mr. Potter while they were in Diagon Alley. They moved off that staircase to another, and James continued, Dad never talks about you-know-who, ever. Neither does Rose's parents, and they were involved in helping Dad defeat the guy from the very beginning. I felt pretty dumb that all these strangers knew more about Dad than I did. I had to look up the story in old editions of the Daily Prophet, the Wizard newspaper, and even it tells precious little. They walked silently together further up the steps, and then James spoke some more. When we were on the train coming here, I tried to warn Albus and Rose what to expect, but it didn't help much. I don't think they really believed me. Rose was in tears by the second day because she couldn't stand all that attention, and I'm sure Albus wasn't much better. I've been telling him that the interest will wear off after a while, but it hasn't yet. Holly nodded. She, too, had been pointed out the Potter family first thing when she arrived, and could now imagine similar conversations having happened all over the school. No, she definitely didn't want that kind of notoriety. Thank you for keeping quiet, she said. James smiled, his brown eyes twinkling. No problem. They'll eventually find out about you, but not from us. He handed Holly her weed book. I believe this is your floor. Holly nodded and took the scratchy book. Thank you. It was nice meeting you, cousin. You too, said James. See you around. And the two parted company.